Representative Henderson,
Excused.
Representative Larson,
Here.
Representative Sherwood. Here. Representative Stith,
Here.
Representative Walters,
Here.
Representative Swanitzer,
Here.
Chairman Nicholas.
Yeah. Okay, first bill up is House Bill 96, Abandoned Mine Land Programs. Alan, company, come on up.
Clerk's bill.
Before we kill this, let's testify.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd sort of present what I think the bill does,
Sure.
if I may. So the purpose of House Bill 96 is quite narrow for many of our other programs, such as business ready communities or mineral royalty grant programs. There's an application process for municipalities. They can apply for the funds, and then in those cases, the State Loan and Investment Board makes a decision. This bill, but for the Abandoned Mine Lands Program, which is a really good program using federal monies only, paid for by taxes on coal that come back to our state. There is no process set out in statute or in rule for a municipality to apply for a particular use of funds or for a particular project that the municipality may believe is eligible. What this bill does is it would require the agency to promulgate rules so that municipalities could apply for AML funds for eligible AML projects, and that the agency, once a complete application is submitted, that the agency would have within 120 days to approve or disapprove it. So the authority to approve or disapprove the application resides solely within the Abandoned Mine Lands Division, doesn't take away any of their authority. And importantly, I think it's important to note what the bill does not do. It does not attempt to rearrange priorities. It does not attempt to make ineligible projects eligible. The situation where it would be most frequently used or could be used would be a municipality where the municipality had identified 2 priority 1 eligible projects, for example. And you can think of say there were a public building that had a mine void underneath it. That would be an eligible AML project. But then there might also be a residential neighborhood that was, say, unimproved lands that had a mine void underneath it. And the agency, in its own discretion, under current rules, the agency would make up its own mind about which project it should do first, or whether it should even do all of them. Right now, the agency gets to decide that. This provides for input from the municipality, in this case, to say, hey, we think that instead of doing this old public building that has a mine void underneath it, don't do that project first. Please do this other residential neighborhood, because we, for example, would like to make this land that currently cannot be used for anything, but is maybe an 11-acre parcel, that we could use it for residential construction because we have a housing shortage in our community. Just use that as an example. And then this does, on page 3, line 14, does require a report back to this committee on the administration of the grant program. This application process, I think it's also important to note that it's permissive. It's not mandatory. There's no requirement that any municipality or anyone actually apply for the funds.
They're also giving it priority, it appears to me.
It does give it, it would give it, if it's a program that is approved by the agency, then it would bump it up in priority, yes. Because, and I think that makes sense. Not legal priority in the sense of whether under federal rules and regulations it has higher priority, because the priority that the federal statute set for eligible projects is not something that we as a state really can alter, right? But rather within eligible categories. So within a priority 1 category, if there were 2 eligible projects, both priority 1, if a municipality says we want this one, and if the department says yes, that's a priority 1 eligible project, then the agency would be obligated to do that project before doing the second project.
What it directs them to,
Yes.
not would. Okay.
I would stand for any other questions.
Mr. Chair. Go ahead.
So I don't know that I'm tracking with that.
Yet I'm trying to, Representative Stith on page 3 under subsection D. The way I read this is if currently, I think right now the agency would have a priority of projects. And the way I read this is if a grant, a municipality applied for and received a grant, then it would have priority over any other project. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that's true. And you
But-
can imagine a situation where you have two municipalities both applying for something, and I think you would just take them in order.
But you said earlier, it doesn't require a change of priorities.
Mr. Chairman, and that's perhaps where the lingo or the language used, I think, in this area of the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, perhaps is a barrier here. There are a set of federal priorities set forth in the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, and those we can't alter. That is, let's imagine that what I really want the funds to be used for is to build a recreation center, some public facility. Just because the municipality says, we would like you to use AML funds to build a new ice rink or hockey rink, for example, just because you want that done, that doesn't make it eligible for an AML project. Nor does it make it, even if it were eligible as an AML project under the so-called lowest tier public facilities section of federal law, that would not trump what federal law already provides, which is that the agency has to
But if
spend
the
its funds.
agency, Mr. Chairman, but if the agency had a priority list, which I think that they have, I think that it runs out a number of years ahead. They have, it's right here, Bob. If they have those projects kind of lined out because they bid those out for years ahead. But if they had been planning on a list for the next fiscal year, and these were the projects, and then a municipality come in and their project qualified, it wouldn't have to wait in line. It would automatically jump to the front. You don't see that as a problem?
Mr. Chairman, and no, and the reason it's not a problem is that frankly, this agency is very service oriented. They respond very quickly. So if in Rock Springs, for example, the county purchased an old bank building, and as they were renovating it, a workman was down in the basement chipping away at a wall, and he lost his tool and it dropped 20 or 30 feet into a void. And so it really was quite shocking to the county that they're building, and AML showed up like the next week and put grout into that. So AML itself is flexible. What I'm saying is, let's imagine you have two priority one projects. Let me use an example of a specific priority one project that the AML, I think, has not touched for about 15 years. And that is about a 11 or 13 acre parcel of unimproved land in the city of Rock Springs that has a huge mine voids underneath it. And in 2007, the agency came and wanted to do something novel. And so they used dynamic compaction to drop a 25-ton weight from 60 feet in the air 2,000 times. And that had some adverse consequences. They didn't work, right? So as a result, I don't think the agency has been back to that neighborhood, right? But the city might say, this is still, your last project failed 15 years ago. It just for 17 years ago now. But it's still a priority one eligible project under federal law. And we think, we as the municipality, we would prefer that you do this rather than that you fill a hole in the ground someplace else.
Alan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Alan Edwards. I'm the Deputy Director for the Department of Environmental Quality. And we do appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Representative Stith has said, there's a lot of challenges out there, and Rock Springs seems in some regards to be the epicenter of a lot of those because of the history of the mining. Couple of points of just clarification. This committee has had a lot of things on their plate that you've gone through, but and Representative Stith, just for a point of clarification, I noticed in the House floor testimony last week, it was referenced that AML has $100 million. In reality, it's $35 million a year is what we get from a combination of two programs. And Representative, the in lieu is one, and then the money through the bill is the other. So the bill funding provides a little under 10 million. In lieu right now is about 25. So total per year, we receive about 35. So just for clarification, those are the numbers we're dealing with. So the director extends his regrets that he couldn't make it tonight. He's got a conflict. But as some of you know, I've got a little history with AML, so it seemed appropriate for me to be here in case there were some other questions that Don couldn't answer. And in the meantime, for the sake of time and brevity, which I know you might consider unusual for me, I'd like to turn it over to Don, who is the current administrator, to just talk about what we see this bill, despite the intent, what it actually seems to address that could be a challenge. So with that, I'll turn it over to Don.
Go ahead, Don.
Mr. Chairman, Don Newton, Administrator of the Abandoned Mine Land Division of DEQ. We see what we think is the intent is to bring in more communication between the AML division and the municipalities on projects that are selected. We communicate with the mayors, city councils all the time. We understand that being able to have input on the selection would be a positive thing, and we agree with that. But we do not see the bill as it is written currently with a grant program accomplishing that. And one of the things we would really like to prevent is unrealistic expectations from a community of being able to get, when I see a grant, I think money. But currently we don't see that this bill would be anything that moves through this bill, the way it is written, would be approved by OSM or the Office of Surface Mining. And I've had conversations with them about this.
Why?
Well, because, we have currently roughly about $100 million of unfunded coal reclamation currently. And the SMACRA dictates the priorities. Priority 1, priority 2, the extreme is priority 1 to protect human health, the environment, and also property. And that's what we do a lot of in our grouting projects is to prevent damage to property. To circumvent that by a grant process and not go directly to those priorities, we think would not be approved by OSM when we went to get authorization to proceed on the project.
Go ahead.
So Dawn, are you in the process, are you saying as you prepare to use the annual funds that come in that you, before you expand them or commit them to a project, you have to get approval for each of the projects that you're working on?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
So as I understand this bill, at least it indicates to me that you don't, you would be the one approving a grant application and you wouldn't have to approve any.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
Well, it doesn't require you to approve any of the grant applications from the municipalities for this bill. Am I seeing that incorrectly?
I'm not sure about that.
Well, you heard the explanation of the bringer. It says that on a priority 1, that grants from municipalities would have a priority over other priority 1 requests. So what that means is that you would take those priority requests, assuming that they were properly priority one. And those will be the first, you'd put a priority list that you submit to SMACRA. Is that right? And they approve or disapprove what your requests are. Is that the process?
They do. They approve every penny we spend.
Pre-approver? Is it a pre-approval? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, yes, it's pre-approval.
So part of the issue is this is that, yeah, the appearance that all of a sudden any community can start applying for grants. That's what you fear. And with giving the representation that they may have an opportunity to actually get funds.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The way we read it, it would likely not be approved by OSM.
So let's just take an example. Let's take Bitter Creek as an example. What, with regards to the Bitter Creek area, would fit into priority one?
Mr. Chairman, with me looking at it, nothing. Not in priority one.
And you said that you have how much reclamation is needed in for priority one projects around the state in dollar wise?
And Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I do not have those broken down in priority one and priority two, but I do know that we have roughly about 100 million in coal reclamation that's unfunded, and that is in construction costs only, not design and construction management by the engineering firms, which is generally another 30%.
And so then over time, does that number, as you spend the dollars, more coal projects come online, I presume, or they not?
Mr. Chairman, they do come. We have many of them come on that we don't know about, but also obviously some go off on an annual basis.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, yes, the inventory number has never been a static number. And as Representative Stiff had indicated, the county health building that had the mine void under it, that was a very exciting period of time. But there is some flexibility within the grant programs to shift the project to future years and put an emergency project up front because of the significant urgency. And just as an example, that particular project just for the construction part was in the range of $1 million, but it saved a downtown building that was very significant. So back and relative to the bill, and I think this might get to the point you were making, is our read is that the communities would be able to submit a grant application. But as noted earlier, the department would have the ability to approve or not approve. The challenge is that under the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, we first have to do the high priority coal before we can go to what would be considered traditional public facilities. And so we would have to turn down every one of those grant applications. There is a public facility program already in place, but that process can't be implemented until such time as all of the coal reclamation has been, the known has been funded. Doesn't mean they have to be complete, they're just funded. So it would put us in an unfortunate position of denying projects because they don't comply with SMACRA.
But not all of these projects necessarily are community service projects. And Representative Stith kind of alluded to Rock Springs. Let's just use that community. What if they had a coal a void that needed addressing? As a result, it was a coal impact. Then that fit into the SMACRA requirement. that kind of changes. I mean, there certainly could be a situation where under Community Hannah, some of those old mines, you know, along the interstate, Hudson had some, how do we respond? Do we respond to a community? Do we bump that ahead of more rural or need? How do you guys make that judgment? And Don, if you wouldn't, maybe if you would also consider what if you took their applications and they would have to pen approval of the federal agency before you could approve them?
Mr. Chairman, the way I understand your question is, do we prioritize remote sites over our sites and communities over remote sites? And that's obviously a yes, if it's a risk, because protecting property is a very high value to us. But we are constantly looking at juggling priorities. Which one makes sense? This year, we're doing a large grouting project under I-80 because it's critical infrastructure in Rock Springs. And if we were to have the interstate shut down for a period of time, it would be an economic disaster for everyone. So we are constantly looking at that, and we are always open to discussion with communities about what they see as a priority. We typically don't get that. I mean, we communicate with the mayor of Rock Springs multiple times a year, the city council, and we let them know what our thoughts are, and we try to get their opinions of what they think our work is, going forward for the next year in planning.
Mr. Chairman.
And Representative Larson, I think partly to get to your point is if they were to submit grant applications, it puts us in a position of, okay, it's not an eligible category right now. If we were to approve that and simply punt it to OSM, my personal concern would be we're not performing our required functions under the act because we're to make those decisions. And then clearly OSM has to approve everything before it can go to construction. It's an awkward situation.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Edwards, I don't know if do you have a copy of the bill in front of you by any chance? So on page 2, line 6. Do you see the sentence that starts with the priority of the award? Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me if I'm reading this correctly. The priority of the award of all grants of abandoned mine land funds for projects requested by local government entities under this section shall be determined in accordance with applicable federal law and the provisions of this article by the governor through the director of or administrator of the Abandoned Mine Lands Division. Does that requirement that you comply with federal law, does that cause you any kind of heartburn?
Mr.
I
Chairman,
mean, I wouldn't think it would.
That's an interesting way to phrase that particular question.
Mr. Chairman, what I mean is this bill would require the division to do what it's already doing with respect to making sure that priority 1 projects are always first. This bill, isn't it true that this bill would never authorize an ineligible project to be authorized? Because by definition, if it's not eligible, then it's not going to comply with federal law, right?
So, Mr. Chairman, to go back to the early language that starts on page 6 or line 6, like you mentioned, the priority of the award of all grants of abandoned mine land funds for projects requested by local government entities under this section shall be determined in accordance with applicable federal law and the provisions of this article by the governor. It would have to be in accordance with all applicable federal laws, which would be SMACRA. And in that regard, public facilities would not currently be an eligible category.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. I'm not talking about public facilities. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario where when the county was renovating the old bank building and they're using their tool to dig away at a wall and they discover a huge mine void beneath it. How the agency in fact responded was commendable. You guys did great. It was amazing. But think of the counterfactual situation. What if when the county called or the city called, what if the agency had said, you know what, we've got $100 million of other priority one projects in front of you. We're not going to get to your building because you're in line behind $100 million worth of other projects. Isn't it the case that under our existing scenario, there's no mechanism for a municipality to apply or a county to apply and say, hey, we've got this building that's about to collapse. It's got a void. We would like to go to the front of the line because we as the county think that's, or the city think that's important. I mean, I guess, why would the sky fall if that were the law?
Mr. Chairman, I'll address that. I think we're sort of conflating a couple of different statements here, at least in my view. So, and I'm not being argumentative, but the process for identifying the highest priorities is pretty much already baked into the system. Because if a county were to approach Dawn and go, look, we've got a real problem here. What would we do? AML would send somebody out, one of the consultants, they'd inspect it and identify it and determine its urgency to do the work, and then the work would be adjusted. So that process is already baked in. But again, the way the department interprets this, we're talking about grants from a community as opposed to notification of a hazard for AML's consideration. So it's, but again, a grant, unless it's specifically related to, we have a high priority issue, we'd like you to take a look at it, which is baked into the system, versus a grant that a community would submit with the expectation of getting funded. And we get hung up on the federal statute and priorities. So I think I understand where you're going, and I've got no argument with that. It's just the mechanics of getting there becomes more difficult. And I would also like to mention, Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the department, and I'll speak for Dawn in this regard, we do appreciate the comments and the compliments about the program, because the program does take pride in its work, as you know, and works hard to do that. And every year, certain adjustments have to be made based on the circumstances that they find in the field. But if you could just put your comment in writing so Don could give it to Todd for his next PMI, it would be appreciated.
So how often do you award or make recommendations to SMACRA on projects that you have improved under your guidelines?
Mr. Chairman, how often we do that? We do that annually throughout the year.
So it's an ongoing process.
It's an ongoing process. Now, before we apply for our grant, you know, currently we look at about a 5-year plan of projects. We have a very small staff, so we have to manage how many projects they can handle. And we plan that out for there's a lot of work that happens before the construction starts, or even before we request authorization to proceed from SMACRA. But we do that usually early in the year. We get the authorization to proceed for the year's work. Now, when emergencies come up, that Representative Stith mentioned the downtown, we had one come up in the fall in Rock Springs. We got a call from a renter that there was a void under the house that he was living in. In 1 week, we had a team out there of consultants and drillers investigating that. So what Mr. Edwards mentioned about urgency, that drives a lot of our work almost annually. not the majority of our work, but it drives, the work we do in very short term.
And to follow on with that, Mr. Chairman, while Don mentioned there's a 5-year plan, the notice to proceed is based on an annual basis. So if there were high priority things that are identified that were not in that 5-year list, the list can be modified and adjusted to reflect priority and the threat that may pose to the public health and safety. So there is flexibility built into the system. So a 5-year plan is more like a guideline. It's not a hard and fast plan. The hard and fast is based upon the annual work and then the emergence of any emergencies that might be identified.
Okay, further questions? Any other public comment?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
one more question. On page 3 of the bill, subsection D, starting at line 8 and going through line 12, as currently drafted, creates this kind of absolute priority that if a city wants something and if it's otherwise eligible as a first priority eligible project under federal law, you would have to drop everything else you were doing and do that one. Would it be more practical if instead of saying that any such grant shall have priority over any other projects, would it be more practical and more workable if instead of saying that, it said that any grant approved shall have as high a priority as practicable, period, and leave it at that, so that your agency weren't handcuffed
So
into dropping everything you're doing?
before you answer that, I think the question ought to be, if you approve something and you submit it to SMACRA and it's approved, it's going to get paid, it's going to be paid for, right? So really it's no longer a matter of priority because you've submitted it and it's been approved, so it's going to get paid for. If you have the sufficient dollars to do it. If you don't, then you finish all the ones that they've approved with whatever money you have. Is that fair? So I think that's the cart before the horse on that question.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. So how would you feel about if you had this same bill, but you eliminated section D, so lines 8 through 12 on page 3 were just gone? How would you feel about the bill then? Assuming that you've got well, not assuming, but given that page 2 requires you to follow all applicable rules and
Proceed
guidelines.
on that too, because what's the purpose of subsection B? Why have the governor involved at all? And that doesn't really, I mean, that's just adding a bureaucratic layer that is, I don't quite understand.
Mr. Chairman, the intent there is not to saddle the governor with additional duties. The actual intent of subsection B was to clarify that the state agency itself doesn't just have the authority to approve projects. They can only do projects that are approved by the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement.
So that means before that's submitted to SMACRA?
Mr. Chairman, the wording is as necessary to administer the grant program. So whatever order that federal laws, rules, and regulations require, do it in whatever their normal order is.
And this program is just a grant program for local governments, nobody else?
Mr. Chairman, as presently drafted, yes.
Go ahead and answer.
Mr. Chairman, I still struggle with the language on page 2 that starts at line 6, whereas the priority of the award of all grants, which implies a grant, when in essence, in truth, the essence of SMACRA is that the priority of the award of all projects funded through abandoned mine land funds shall be determined in accordance with applicable federal law, which is what underpins the act right now. So with the grants in there, it implies a option that doesn't exist under the SMACRA and the priorities that are identified in that sentence. And that's the part I struggle with.
Well, and that makes sense. I mean, but that's just semantics. I think you can fix that. Yeah.
So I think that the use of the term grant is kind of wonky per what you do, because you're the agency and the bill, you might help me here, but you're identifying a project that needs remediation, or just, I don't know the right word there. But if you use the term grant, to me, it implies that you then are giving them the funding, they go out and independently resolve whatever it is they're doing. Where I think under the AML program, you guys, through however those are identified, have final oversight through the letting of the bids for design and for remedial. Is that the right word? What's the word I want to use if it's not remediation?
Mr. Chairman, reclamation.
Reclamation, and then from reclamation. And so I'm wondering, Mr. Chairman, if we couldn't come back and address some of that language and then try this horse again, because I'd be like.
Mr. Chairman, that sounds like an excellent idea to conform the language so that it fits with their existing program. Because the purpose of the bill is not to change their program or to have them hand bags of money over to city engineers for them to go play with. That's not the idea is not to change how the division itself does business.
Yeah, so,
Would we table this?
yeah, we'll table this. Clark, why don't you play with it and then let's get a draft, yeah, and just circulate it and then
Don, we
we'll
might
be back.
be picking your brain.
Pardon me,
Says we might be picking your brain.
Mr.
Make sure
Chairman,
we
that
got
would be great. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, I do want to thank you for the opportunity to appear here, and I'm glad Representative Larson posed that comment to Don instead of me, because you're going to pick my brain. You only needed 2 picks. It's a much smaller work deal.
I
But
think
again,
it's,
thank you for letting us be here.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's because I still have scars from trying to work with that one.
Okay, we gotta move on. We're running out of time. We've got a
Thank you.
meeting in 20 minutes. We gotta go to. So. House Bill 75. This is back on the table. We have, I think we've taken public comment. We've closed public comment. So let's go to the bill. Do we have an amendment? Come on up. You can still participate. Go ahead. Yeah, I think let's just go straight to the amendments.
Section 4, I move to create a new section known as C. And it will read, this act shall not apply to University of Wyoming dorm project. In Romanet 1, Romanet 2 will be University of Wyoming Law School project. Romanet 3, University of Wyoming West Stands project. Romanet 4, University of Wyoming Aquatic Center.
Second.
So I would add one more caveat, that it doesn't go in effect to UW until 2028. Okay. Everyone understand the amendment? Correct. Everyone understand the amendment in the concept? Here again. 28. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed? That motion carries. Any other amendments? Lloyd?
So, Mr. Chairman, I would make a motion on page, it'd be on page 20 of the bill. And to add a provision in for contractors or for a public entity when there's an emergency to have the ability to solicit contracts outside the provisions of this subsection. So if I could get a second, I'll.
Second.
So we had a proposed amendment from, and I really appreciated the time that our good administrator of the airport in Rock Springs come to us because he seen an opportunity to fix a problem. The amendment that he brought was great, and I think we have a copy of it. But I think it missed what he was trying to do, which was in the event that there's an emergency, and still have to comply with the provisions of residency. So I went back and I looked what we do in professional services, that's architects, engineers, and surveyors. And there, when an emergency arises, they're able to negotiate. So they don't let bids, they negotiate. But they allow them to negotiate one-on-one, and if it's outside the residency, they can do that. So my proposed amendment would be, as you can see here in page 20, we're actually in 16.6.102A. There's B, C, D, E, F, and G. We'd create a new G, which says whenever an emergency arises requiring a contract of a public work, a public entity may waive any applicable requirements of this subsection if the requirement endangers health, welfare, or safety of the public.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries. Any other amendments? Don, or Lloyd, Tom, anything else? Okay. As amended, roll call on the bill.
Representative Henderson. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood. Aye. Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Representative Swanitzer.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye. Okay, we have our re-referrals. First one is Natural Resource Protection Act.
Which number?
Do we have anyone here to present on? Suppose does anyone here familiar with it? We can wait till tomorrow. Who's built, this is natural resource.
One's agriculture, and one's the Select Federal Natural Resource Management.
I'm inclined. Well,
Mr. Chairman, I would appreciate particularly on the ag one, and I know that we've got some wildlife people here. I've got a little bit of concern on the increased amounts for damage control on rangeland, and think that there needs to be a little more definition on how, for example, it says one of the requirements is that the landowner, in order to qualify for this, the landowner has to allow hunting on the land, but that might just be you allowing me. And I think that it needs to be a little broader in the public term, and I think that I think it would be good to have
well, and
them.
what I don't really understand is, it's more of a 15% of the rangeland. a herd of 50 elk can do that to 120 acres in 2 days. And so it's, that doesn't make sense to me. So let's just defer both of them until we have a chance to have testimony. Okay, with that, I think that's all we have for the day then.
What time tomorrow, Mr. Chairman?
So we need to be here at 7:30. You can go up and